The corridors of Titan Station's maximum security detention facility hummed with the kind of artificial gravity that never quite felt natural, despite humanity's centuries of experience with orbital habitats. Lieutenant Alex Harper adjusted his diplomatic credentials one final time before approaching the checkpoint that separated the civilian areas from what the staff euphemistically called special housing. "First time meeting her?" asked Commander Walsh, the facility's chief of operations, as she verified Harper's authorization codes. "Word of advice, don't expect conversation. She hasn't spoken a word since arriving 6 weeks ago." Harper nodded, though privately he wondered if anyone had actually tried talking to Queen Seraphina rather than simply interrogating her. The files he'd reviewed painted a picture of systematic questioning focused on military intelligence and war crimes evidence, but nothing that resembled actual communication. "What's her physical condition?" he asked. "Stable but concerning. She eats just enough to survive, never speaks, rarely moves. The medical staff thinks she might be in some form of psychological shock, but Nexary physiology is still largely unknown to us." They passed through 3 additional security checkpoints, each one scanning Harper's biometrics against the facility's database. The measures seemed excessive until he remembered exactly who they were designed to contain: Queen Seraphina of the Nexary Empire, responsible for the destruction of 43 human colonies and the deaths of over 8 million civilians during her 20-year campaign across the Outer Rim territories. "The Tribunal's been frustrated by her complete non-cooperation," Commander Walsh continued as they approached the final secured door. "They're hoping a diplomatic approach might succeed where military interrogation has failed." Harper paused at the threshold, reviewing what he knew about the woman beyond the door. The intelligence files described her as ruthless, calculating, and utterly without remorse for the devastation she'd caused. Military analysts called her the most dangerous individual ever captured by human forces. The media had dubbed her the Blood Empress, a title that seemed to fit someone who had turned entire star systems into graveyards. Yet something in the psychological profiles troubled him. The tactical analyses praised her strategic brilliance and noted the precision of her military operations. For someone supposedly driven by bloodlust, Queen Seraphina had demonstrated remarkable efficiency and what could almost be called restraint in her choice of targets. "She's been completely silent?" Harper asked. "Completely. Won't respond to questions, commands, or even medical examinations. Just sits there like a statue." The door slid open with a soft pneumatic hiss, revealing a sterile interrogation chamber designed more for comfort than intimidation. Standard diplomatic protocols, Harper realized. Someone in the tribunal was taking their legal obligations seriously, despite the prisoner's reputation. Queen Seraphina sat at the room's central table with perfect posture, her hands folded in her lap, staring straight ahead at nothing. Harper's first impression was of otherworldly beauty trapped in absolute stillness, features that managed to be both alien and hauntingly familiar, framed by the pointed ears that marked her species. Her skin held a metallic silver quality that seemed almost luminous under the chamber's soft lighting. She was smaller than he'd expected, perhaps 5.5 feet tall, with a delicate build that seemed incongruous with her reputation as a military commander. The standard prison uniform couldn't disguise the natural grace in her posture or the aristocratic bearing that spoke of generations of royal breeding. "Your Majesty," Harper said formally, taking the seat across from her. "I'm Lieutenant Harper, assigned as diplomatic liaison for your case. I hope we can have a productive conversation." No response. Not even a flicker of acknowledgement that she'd heard him speak. Harper had prepared for this possibility. "I understand you may have concerns about the tribunal process. I'm here to ensure your rights are protected according to interstellar law." Still nothing. Queen Seraphina's expression remained perfectly neutral, her silver skin showing no color changes that might indicate emotional response. According to the intelligence briefings, Nexary skin typically shifted through various hues based on their emotional states, but Seraphina's coloration had remained constant since her capture. "I've reviewed the charges against you," Harper continued, maintaining a conversational tone despite the one-sided nature of the exchange. The tribunal is prepared to consider any evidence you might offer regarding the circumstances of your military campaigns. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the facility's background hum. Harper found himself studying her face, looking for any sign of the monster described in the files. Instead, he saw exhaustion so profound it seemed to radiate from her very being, as if she carried the weight of entire worlds on her shoulders. The facility's medical staff is concerned about your health, he tried. Is there anything you need? Any accommodations that would make your stay more comfortable? For just a moment, Harper thought he saw something flicker behind her eyes, a flash of what might have been surprise or perhaps pain. But her expression returned to perfect neutrality so quickly he wondered if he'd imagined it. As the session concluded without progress, Harper found himself troubled by the disconnect between the woman sitting before him and the legend that had terrorized human space for 2 decades. Queen Seraphina looked less like a conqueror and more like someone who had experienced losses too great to comprehend. Walking back through the facility's security checkpoints, Harper made a decision that would alter the course of both their lives. Instead of focusing on military intelligence and war crimes evidence, he would try something the tribunal had never attempted, treating Queen Seraphina like a person rather than a monster, and seeing if compassion might succeed where interrogation had failed. Harper's second visit to Queen Seraphina began with the same ritual: security checks, biometric scans, and the long walk through progressively more secure sections of the facility. This time, however, he carried a small bag containing items that had nothing to do with military intelligence or tribunal proceedings. Still planning to talk to a statue? Commander Walsh asked with barely concealed skepticism. Sometimes the best conversations happen when only one person is speaking, Harper replied, though privately he wondered if his approach was naive optimism rather than diplomatic strategy. The interrogation chamber looked exactly the same, and so did Queen Seraphina. She sat in perfect stillness, her silver skin showing no variation in color, her expression as neutral as carved marble. Harper took his seat and placed the bag on the table between them. "Good morning, Your Majesty," he began, maintaining the same respectful tone he'd used during their first meeting. "I brought a few things I thought you might appreciate." He withdrew a small potted plant from the bag, a flowering specimen from the station's hydroponics bay that bloomed in shades of blue and white. "This is a Terran orchid, genetically modified to thrive in artificial environments. The botanists say it's one of the most beautiful flowers humans have cultivated." Queen Seraphina's gaze didn't shift from its fixed point somewhere past Harper's shoulder, but he thought he detected the slightest change in her breathing pattern. Encouraged, he continued. "I also brought some music," Harper said, activating a small audio device. "This is a piece by a composer named Rachmaninoff, a human who lived several centuries ago. The piece is called Vocalize, and it's considered one of the most emotionally moving works in our classical repertoire." The haunting melody filled the chamber, its wordless vocals expressing emotions that transcended language barriers. Harper watched Seraphina's face carefully, noting subtle changes that would have been invisible to casual observation, a slight softening around her eyes, an almost imperceptible relaxation in her posture. Music was important in pre-war Nexari culture, according to our xenological studies, Harper said softly, speaking over the melody. "Your people were known for creating compositions that could induce specific emotional states in listeners. Some of your early works are still studied by human musicologists." This time, the reaction was unmistakable. Queen Seraphina's silver skin showed the faintest trace of blue coloration, so brief it might have been a trick of the lighting. But Harper had been watching too carefully to miss it. "I've read some of your poetry," he continued, pulling a data tablet from his bag. "The translations are probably inadequate, but even in standard, the imagery is remarkable. This one is called Dawn over Velsheri. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly." He read aloud from the tablet, his voice carrying the rhythm of the translated verses. The poem spoke of morning light touching crystal spires, of hope rising with the sun, of love that transcended the boundaries between souls. It was beautiful, gentle work that seemed to come from an entirely different person than the military commander who had devastated human space. The biographical notes say you wrote that during your youth, before ascending to the throne, Harper said. It's hard to reconcile the person who created such beauty with. He trailed off, realizing he'd been about to mention her military campaigns. Instead, he watched as her skin showed more pronounced blue patterns, colors that, according to his research, indicated sadness or regret among the Nexari. I'm sorry, Harper said quietly. I didn't mean to cause you distress. For several hours, they sat together in the chamber while Rachmaninoff's music played softly in the background. Harper spoke about Earth, about the beauty of natural phenomena that survived even in humanity's technological age. He described sunsets over oceans, the northern lights dancing across polar skies, the way snow fell on mountain peaks during winter storms. Queen Seraphina never responded verbally, but her skin continued to show faint color changes that suggested his words were reaching her. Blue when he spoke of loss or sadness, brief flashes of gold when he described particularly beautiful scenes, deeper silver during moments of silence that seemed heavy with unspoken thoughts. The tribunal is scheduled to begin formal proceedings next week, Harper said as their session neared its end. You have the right to legal representation, to present evidence in your defense, to speak on your own behalf if you choose. The blue coloration deepened, and for a moment Harper thought he saw moisture gathering in her eyes. But Queen Seraphina's expression remained perfectly controlled, and he wondered if he was seeing things that weren't there. I know what the files say about you, Harper continued. But I also know that people are more complex than their worst actions. Whatever happened during your campaigns, whatever choices you made, you're still a person deserving of dignity and fair treatment. As he prepared to leave, Harper noticed something that made him pause. Queen Seraphina's gaze had shifted slightly, no longer fixed on the empty air but focused somewhere near the orchid he'd brought. It was a small change, but after hours of perfect stillness, it felt significant. I'll see you tomorrow, he said softly. The flower is yours to keep. Walking back through the facility's corridors, Harper reflected on the day's progress. Queen Seraphina hadn't spoken, but her reaction suggested someone in profound emotional pain rather than the remorseless killer described in the military reports. Tomorrow, he decided, he would try a different approach, not as an interrogator or even a diplomat, but simply as one person reaching out to another across the vast gulf of species and circumstance. The image that stayed with him was the brief moment when her skin had shone gold, the Nexari color for hope or joy. Whatever darkness had consumed Queen Seraphina's life, some spark of her original nature still survived beneath the weight of 20 years' worth of terrible choices. 2 weeks into their daily sessions, Harper had accumulated a collection of small observations that painted a picture radically different from the tribunal's official narrative. Queen Seraphina's reactions to beauty were too genuine, too immediate, to belong to someone whose nature was fundamentally cruel. When he played certain pieces of music, her skin showed golden patterns that suggested deep emotional resonance. When he read poetry, both human works and translations of her own early writings, her breathing changed in ways that indicated recognition and pain. I've been researching Nexari cultural history, Harper said during their 15th session, setting a cup of tea on the table beside the orchid that had become a permanent fixture in the chamber. Your people weren't conquerors originally. The pre-contact records describe a civilization focused on artistic achievement and philosophical inquiry. Queen Seraphina's silver skin showed faint blue traces, the color becoming more pronounced as Harper continued. The transformation to military expansion only began about 25 years ago, just before your ascension to the throne. Something changed during that period, but the historical records are incomplete. Harper studied her face carefully. The timing suggests external pressure rather than internal cultural shift. For the first time since their sessions had begun, Queen Seraphina's gaze moved to focus directly on Harper's face. The eye contact lasted only seconds before she looked away, but it felt like a breakthrough. I've been wondering about the tactical patterns in your campaigns, Harper continued, pulling up star charts on his data tablet. Military analysts call your strategies brilliant but note some unusual characteristics. You consistently attacked infrastructure targets rather than population centers. Your forces always provided advance warning before orbital bombardments. Casualty ratios were lower than expected for total warfare scenarios. The blue coloration in her skin deepened, and Harper caught something that might have been a suppressed sob. "Those aren't the patterns of someone who enjoys causing suffering," he said gently. "They're the patterns of someone trying to minimize casualties while achieving necessary objectives. The question is, what made those objectives necessary?" Queen Seraphina's hands, which had remained perfectly still for weeks, began to tremble slightly. Harper noticed her breathing had become irregular, as if she were fighting some internal battle between silence and the need to speak. "The tribunal has focused on individual battles and casualty counts," Harper continued, "but they haven't asked about motivation. They've assumed malice without considering alternatives." He pulled up additional records, including communications logs from the early phases of her campaign. These intercepted transmissions show Nexari forces consistently attempting to evacuate civilian populations before attacking infrastructure. "That's not standard conquest behavior, it's rescue behavior." Queen Seraphina's control finally cracked enough for a single sound to escape, an intake of breath that carried 20 years of suppressed anguish. Her skin showed rapid color changes, cycling between blue, silver, and darker hues that Harper's research suggested indicated complex emotional states. "Whatever was happening in Nexari space, it was bad enough to make you choose exile and universal hatred over letting your people face it alone," Harper said, his voice soft but certain. "You weren't conquering human territories, you were fleeing something worse." The trembling in her hands intensified, and Harper saw moisture gathering in her eyes despite her obvious efforts to maintain composure. 20 years of perfect emotional control were crumbling under the weight of someone finally seeing past the legend to understand the truth. "The evacuation patterns make sense if you were trying to stay ahead of some kind of threat," Harper continued, pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. "Something that made remaining in Nexari space impossible, something that required immediate population dispersal across multiple star systems." Queen Seraphina's breathing had become shallow and rapid, her skin showing patterns Harper had never seen before, complex swirls of color that suggested emotional states beyond the simple categories in his research materials. "The timing of your attacks correlates with astronomical data about stellar phenomena in the Nexari home systems," Harper said, consulting his notes. "Several stars showing unusual radiation signatures, reports of planetary environmental changes that preceded your military movements." A single tear escaped Queen Seraphina's control, tracking down her silver cheek like liquid starlight. The sight hit Harper with unexpected emotional force. This was the first crack in her facade since her capture, the first sign that the person beneath the legend was still alive. "Your Majesty," Harper said softly, "whatever threat you were fleeing, whatever impossible choice you faced, the truth might be the key to understanding everything that happened." Queen Seraphina's eyes met his again, and this time they held for long moments. Harper saw depths of pain and guilt that spoke of someone who had carried an unbearable burden alone for decades. Behind the legend of the Blood Empress was someone who had sacrificed everything, reputation, happiness, the chance for peace, to save lives on a scale that human minds could barely comprehend. "The human casualties were real," Harper said, understanding flooding through him. "But they weren't the objective, they were the tragic cost of preventing something even worse." More tears began to flow, and Queen Seraphina's perfect posture finally collapsed as 20 years of isolation and self-imposed silence took their toll. Harper realized he was witnessing the breakdown of someone who had chosen to be seen as a monster rather than reveal a truth too terrible to share. "You're not the villain in this story," Harper said with growing certainty. "You're the hero who chose to bear the weight of universal hatred rather than let entire civilizations die ignorant and unprepared." Queen Seraphina's silver skin showed golden patterns for the first time since her capture, brief flashes of the color that indicated hope or recognition. Harper understood that he was seeing the first glimpse of who she had been before the weight of impossible choices had forced her to become something else entirely. The 20th session began with Queen Seraphina's first voluntary movement since her capture. As Harper entered the chamber, she turned her head to acknowledge his presence, a small gesture that felt monumental after weeks of statue-like stillness. Her silver skin showed subtle blue patterns that had become more pronounced with each passing day, and the moisture in her eyes suggested someone on the verge of emotional collapse. "Good morning, Your Majesty," Harper said, taking his usual seat across from her. The orchid had bloomed again, its blue and white petals adding a touch of natural beauty to the sterile chamber. For the first time, Queen Seraphina's lips moved as if she might speak, but only silence emerged. Harper could see the internal struggle playing out across her alien features, 20 years of self-imposed isolation warring against the human need for connection and understanding. "I've been thinking about beauty," Harper said gently, abandoning his prepared questions about military tactics and stellar phenomena. "How it persists even in the darkest circumstances. How recognizing it in others can be an act of grace." Queen Seraphina's breathing became irregular, her skin showing rapid color changes that suggested intense emotional processing. Harper realized he was witnessing someone who hadn't allowed herself to feel anything for decades suddenly confronting the full weight of her suppressed humanity. "The files describe you as a monster," Harper continued, his voice soft but clear, "but they can't explain why someone supposedly without conscience would write poetry about dawn light and eternal love. They can't reconcile the tactical precision that minimized casualties with the image of mindless brutality." Tears began flowing freely down her silver cheeks, each drop catching the chamber's lighting like liquid crystal. Harper felt something shift in the air between them, the invisible barrier she had maintained since capture finally beginning to crack. "The tribunal sees only the outcome of your choices," Harper said, "but I see someone who made impossible decisions under circumstances no one should have to face. Someone who chose to be hated rather than let people die unprepared." Queen Seraphina's control finally shattered completely. Her perfect posture collapsed as she buried her face in her hands, 20 years of suppressed grief pouring out in sobs that seemed to echo from her very soul. Harper waited, understanding that this breakdown was necessary, the first step toward healing from wounds that had festered in silence for far too long. When she finally looked up, her eyes met his with an intensity that took his breath away. Behind the tears and pain, Harper saw intelligence, compassion, and a strength that had endured unimaginable burdens. He saw someone who had sacrificed everything for duty, who had chosen exile and hatred over revealing truths too terrible to share. "You're beautiful," Harper said simply, the words emerging from a place deeper than diplomacy or strategy. Not physical beauty, though she possessed that in abundance, but the beauty of someone who had carried impossible weight for the sake of others. The beauty of sacrifice and moral complexity, of choosing to be the villain so others could live. The effect was immediate and transformative. Queen Seraphina's silver skin blazed with golden patterns more brilliant than any Harper had seen before, her tears flowing with renewed intensity but somehow cleaner, as if washing away years of accumulated darkness. "You see me," she whispered, her voice barely audible after months of silence. The words carried 20 years of isolation, the desperate need of someone who had hidden her true self behind necessary lies. "I see you," Harper confirmed, understanding that this moment would change everything, not just for the tribunal, but for the relationship between their species and the truth about what had really happened during the Nexary expansion. "The Devourers," Queen Seraphina said suddenly, her voice stronger but still broken by emotion. "That's what we called them. They came from between the stars, parasites that consumed planets from within. Silent. Invisible until too late." Harper felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place as she continued, words pouring out after decades of enforced silence. "They had already taken our core worlds when I ascended to the throne. Millions dying every day while they bred and spread. The only way to stop them was complete evacuation, abandon everything and scatter the population across as many systems as possible. The human colonies," Harper said, understanding flooding through him, "were the only habitable worlds within range of our evacuation ships. We tried to negotiate, to explain, but your people couldn't detect the Devourers. They thought we were invaders rather than refugees." Her tears intensified. "Every battle, every casualty, I chose to be seen as a conqueror rather than reveal the truth and cause panic that would make evacuation impossible. You saved billions of lives," Harper said softly. At the cost of being hated by every survivor. The Nexari who escaped think I'm a coward who abandoned our homeworld. Humans think I'm a monster who destroyed theirs. The truth died with our planets. Queen Seraphina's skin showed complex patterns of gold mixed with deep blue, hope struggling with guilt that had consumed her for 20 years. Harper realized he was looking at someone who had chosen to bear universal condemnation rather than let entire civilizations die ignorant and unprepared. The devourers are still out there, she continued, her voice growing stronger. Spreading slower now that their primary food source is gone, but still advancing. Humanity will encounter them eventually, probably within the next decade. Harper felt the weight of revelation settling around them. Queen Seraphina wasn't a war criminal, she was a tragic hero whose greatest crime had been caring too much about life to let the truth prevent her from saving it. Will you help me tell them? Harper asked. The tribunal, humanity, everyone who needs to know what's really coming. Queen Seraphina looked at him with eyes that held 20 years of accumulated hope finally given voice. Yes, she whispered. For the first time in decades, yes. As they prepared to face the tribunal together, Harper reflected on the power of recognition, how calling someone beautiful could shatter barriers that interrogation and intimidation never could. Queen Seraphina's tears had washed away the legend of the Blood Empress, revealing someone whose beauty lay not in her appearance but in the terrible courage required to sacrifice everything for the greater good. The truth would change everything, about the war, about the Nexari, about the relationship between species facing a threat that made their previous conflict seem insignificant. But it had begun with a simple recognition of beauty in someone the universe had chosen to call a monster.